Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. You're watching our event, our EGN event. Does press freedom have any limits? Our speakers today are Aidan White, who is the director of the Ethical Journalism Network, and Annette Young, who is the senior journalist for Franz von Katz's show, The 51%. Thank you both for being here. So I'll go ahead and just start off our debate. The first question I'll give to Aidan. In September 2011, there was a UN committee that said that there are absolutely no circumstances which justify limiting freedom of expression. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I mean, I don't agree with it, and actually neither does the United Nations agree with it, so I'm very surprised that a UN group should be saying that sort of thing. Of course there are limits to free expression. Those limits are very often set down by law. There are simple limits about the fact that you can't use free expression to incite violence against people or against groups of people. You can't use your right to free expression to endanger or put it at risk people at large by, for instance, disclosing secrets which actually might endanger or threaten the community. There are a whole range of areas where I think there are legitimate but narrowly defined limits to free expression. I think it's very clear. What we have to do, though, is to sort of make sure that we protect free expression, because the most important thing about free expression is that it is the right of people to really say what they think, as long as they don't do real harm to others or threaten harm to others. So people have the right to be offensive. They have the right, if they want to say things that other people would find outrageous. And I think it's an essential characteristic of free expression to protect the right of people to say what they think, providing they don't do serious damage to others. So within very narrowly defined restrictions and limits, of course there should be a maximum amount of free expression.
Annette, what's your take?
I'd have to agree with Aidan on that, particularly given that I was here in Paris in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which itself sparked a whole very sort of moving and passionate discussion within France about the notion of free speech. And of course the problem is, as I'm sure Aidan is aware, is there are cultural differences too that need to be taken into account. Myself, being the product of an Australian journalism culture, probably have a different view than, say, some of my French colleagues who believe that there should be freedom of speech come hell or high water. I come from a background where, like Aidan, I believe that very strongly in the concept of freedom of speech, as long as it doesn't result in violence or discrimination as such. And again, that's probably because I am the product of a culture in Australia which is very much aware of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess speaking of cultural issues, I mean, as we all know, the Charlie Hebdo shooting is kind of one of the huge examples this year that kind of showcases that. After the event, a lot of journalists were wondering, do we need to self-censor ourselves to respect, I guess, religious sensitivities?
Well, look, I wonder, I mean, it seems to me that it's very important that we put the Charlie Hebdo event, and actually this week, I think, we are in the week of the 10th anniversary of the cartoons that were printed in Denmark, Jyllands-Posten, which apparently sparked a great free expression debate. There's a real distinction we have to make between a debate about the right to free expression and the political manipulation of an issue to suit the political objectives of a narrow and extremist minority. And what we've seen is, both in terms of how the original Danish cartoons crisis erupted 10 years ago, and to a certain extent in the way that the Charlie Hebdo, the terrible events at Charlie Hebdo have been used and manipulated, we have seen a political offensive and information war being started by people who have no interest in the debate about free expression at all. They are only interested in using and manipulating ideas to try to suit their particular political ideology. And what we in the media have got to do is to make a real distinction between where the debate is about free expression and avoid being drawn into being manipulated by people who want to use the free expression debate as part of their political weaponry to fight their wars, whether it's against the United States or it's actually to sort of advance their rather twisted notions of how people should be forced to live their lives in the Middle East. And we see that in the way that ISIS have developed a very sophisticated system for seeking to use communications as a way of building support for their ideology. We should not allow legitimate discussion over free expression to be hijacked in this way by extremists. And unfortunately, I think very often we in the media fall into the trap of thinking, oh, we have to protect free expression. I don't think this is a free expression debate. I think this is a debate about democracy, the right to people to live, for the right of people to live their lives without violent intimidation and so on. And I think we have to therefore get it in perspective. So I think this is one of the reasons why the whole question of hate speech and the way that hate speech is used by extremist groups is one of the sort of key issues that we in the journalistic community have to really address in the coming period.
Okay, well, I guess a follow-up question to that, which I will let Annette respond to. I don't know if you saw Charlie Hebdo. They recently the recent cover was a satire cartoon of the drowned Syrian boy. I mean, should that sort of speech be protected, or at least should it be protected in journalism?
Look, the question about that, about Charlie Hebdo, is the question of where is Charlie Hebdo in the world of media? Charlie Hebdo is a small circulation magazine operating mainly in the metropolitan areas of Paris and the big cities of France. It's hardly known outside France at all. Charlie Hebdo has been able successfully, it seems to me, to exercise its freedom of speech without causing disturbance or difficulties for France and for various communities in France for many, many years. If I was the editor-in-chief of Charlie Hebdo, would I have used the front pages that they've used? Probably not. Would I have actually sort of used what you're talking about, the picture of Aylin Kurdi in the way that they did? I don't know, probably not. But that's because I have a different view and a different view about how to put things forward. They are fully entitled to try to put their own interpretation, their own expression into effect. What we mustn't do is to allow ourselves to think that Charlie Hebdo is setting the barometer for how all journalism should be practiced. It has to be seen in context, and this context is very clear. Charlie Hebdo operates in a confined market in an area of France where it is able to survive and to practice and exercise free expression without restraint. That only becomes a problem when the issue is picked up by extremists and who decide to use reckless violence, as they did in January this year, to try to get their message across. The attack on Charlie Hebdo was unspeakable and unacceptable, and no one at all said it could have been justified in any way. So what we don't learn from that is that we have to second guess and question every headline and front page that Charlie Hebdo put on. And from my point of view, they can do what the heck they want, providing they stay within the parameters of free expression, which is making sure they don't do direct harm to others.
Annette, do you have anything to add?
I think, what it's obviously, a very intellectual response. The problem is, of course, is that the people who do respond in the way that we all saw back in January clearly do not have the capacity to make that distinction, and that is part of the problem. I agree. I mean, with everything that Aidan says, it fits very much with my response to the situation, but it is a difficult situation. It is very hard for the political establishment here, as well as media outlets, to address the issues of a community which is becoming ethnically diverse. And I think it's sort of linked into a broader issue about what's happening here in France, and that is the debate over multiculturalism versus integration. It's a much more broader issue, and it certainly doesn't fit into the context of what we're talking about today. And I would hope, if there's anything positive to come out of all of this these horrific events, is the fact there is now a discussion about has integration worked. And just for the person who might not be familiar with the difference between the two, is that in France, unlike Australia, where I come from, which very much celebrates its multicultural, diverse population, in France, it's more a case of integration, which is you speak French, therefore you are French, and the Republic comes first and foremost above everything else. That clearly hasn't been working, and one of the direct results of that, sadly, has been what transpired in January. So that is, another issue to be discussed, obviously, in another debate, but I think it is something for the media elite and the political elite here in France to be very aware of, that there are sensitivities, and whereas, again, I have a foot in both countries, so I can see both perspectives. In Australia, probably there is, I would suspect, a little bit of self-censorship, because there is an anti-discrimination law which is very strong, and it makes people think twice about what to publish or what to air or what to post. Here is not necessarily the same culture.
I wonder if I can take up what Annette says there, which I think is absolutely right and very interesting, except that I wouldn't use the term self-censorship. I think I make a distinction between self-censorship and good editorial judgment. Self-censorship is the process of journalism which is defined by fear. Journalists and editors make decisions on the basis of the threats and the retaliation that they can expect if they behave in a certain way. Good editorial judgment is about making decisions about what you publish and what you don't publish, which take into account the ethical basis on which you're working. So, for example, if you've got a headline which you think is potentially going to be deeply offensive to a section of your audience, you might say, we won't use that headline. We'll use another form of words. That isn't self-censorship in my view. That is a question of applying good editorial judgment. The question is, to make the distinction, is that decision taken freely? Is the journalist, is the editor free to make that decision rather than being intimidated? For example, if the decision that the editor takes, oh, I can't use that headline because I'm afraid that somebody will come and throw a petrol bomb through the window of our media organization, or that I might put at risk my own staff, that's a different matter. Then that moves into the realms of what you might call self-censorship. And I think it gets to the heart of what this conversation is about, why ethics are important. Ethics are important because they help journalists to make those editorial decisions freely about what is appropriate. This picture or that picture, this headline or that headline, using this source of information or that source of information. All of these are editorial judgments, but that they have to be freely made, and they should be ethically made, with journalists being conscious of the fact that they have to make sure that they're telling the right facts, that they're impartial, they're independent, they're showing humanity in the way they do their journalism, and they're making themselves accountable. Providing they're free to do that, then that's good editorial judgment. Anything else where they feel they're forced to behave in a certain way, that's self-censorship, and that's not acceptable.
Aidan, could I just pose a question to you, which is what I was saying earlier, that there are cultural differences that do kick in. The notion of humour, for instance, differs, say, from the way the French view satire and humour versus the way the Brits and the Australian do, and you see that. Whereas, I mean, I'll be honest, I find a lot of the Charlie Hebdo stuff rather puerile and certainly doesn't make me laugh, and it makes me cringe. But there are a number of my French colleagues who don't feel that way, and again, that comes back to cultural differences. So I think I'm very cognizant of having worked in various points around the globe, which is what might work for some doesn't necessarily work for others. So what I'd like to ask you, given your experience and your expertise, how do you get that across in an international sense, in a global sense, taking into account cultural differences?
It's a really tricky question. It's a good one as well, because it's the sort of battle that's being fought in the newsrooms of organizations like Associated Press or Agence France Presse or Reuters or CNN or the BBC, which have large international audiences. So consequently, they are really sort of trying to make sure that they don't deeply offend any sort of particular section. As you get closer to the area where media are providing services, so if you go from the global scene to the regional scene to the national scene, journalists are much more sensitive. to local cultural differences and so on. So you see a marked difference between how things are approached in South Asia, for instance, as to how they're approached in London and Washington or Paris by the media. My view about it is that actually there are certain universal principles which transcend cultural barriers and differences, and those universal principles are basically the ethics of journalism and the way that journalism is practiced. So that question of we don't have deceptive handling of the facts, we don't act as a propagandist, we don't deliberately stoke up violence and hatred between different groups, and we do take responsibility for the mistakes that we make. Those apply all over the world. And those apply in all cultures. So what we mustn't do is allow the legitimate right to respect cultural mores as they are to get in the way of the application of the fundamental principles of journalism and journalistic ethics. And there are about 400 codes of conduct for journalists around the world, and they come from all different cultures, political cultures and linguistic cultures and so on. But when you look at them all and you boil them down, those 5 principles tend to be right at the heart of it. Fact-based communications, independent commentary, impartial treatment of information and seeking all sides of the story, humanity in the way we tell the story, and respect for the audience, and accountability. Those work the world over, and they are not subject, in my view, to some sort of cultural modification.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about migration, because that's the main story in the news right now. So I guess kind of going along with our theme, from a journalistic point of view, what do you think are the limits to expression around the migration story?
Well, they're the same. I mean, they're always the same.
I guess more the specifics to the story. Specifics to the migration story, I guess.
Well, if you look at the migration story, this is one of the, of course, it's the biggest story of the year for media everywhere. And the first thing to say is the global story. It's got local impact to it, particularly in places like Australia, certainly in Europe, certainly in the United States, but actually it's a global story. And the story has 2 sides to it. One is the story of numbers. Media are sort of concerned about numbers. Communities concerned about numbers. How many people are coming? Are we going to be able to cope with these numbers? So there's the numbers story, and it's a legitimate concern. So media have to tackle that story and tell that story without feeding either resentments or unnecessary fears and concerns. The second arm of the story is the humanity story. It's the empathy story. It's the sight of the little body of Aylin Kurdi on a Turkish beach, which moved millions of people and drove for a while the media to look at the story in terms of the human story, the human angle to it. And that's quite a different approach than the numbers story. The fact of the matter is, to cover migration, journalists and media have to have both sides of this story. They have to cover the numbers angle, they have to cover the human interest angle and so on. But what they must do above all else is to set the story in proper context, to make sure that they're not allowing politicians, and there are many of them, to get away with outrageous statements, to get away with feeding and stoking hatreds and resentments and so on. Whether they're politicians, or whether they're religious leaders, or whether they're sort of community leaders who've got political mischief to make, media have to be very, very careful. So this is a time for careful, sensitive, informed journalism. Having said that, it's very easy to say that. The fact of the matter is, many of the journalists covering the story don't know enough about migration. They don't properly know the difference between what is a migrant, what is a refugee, what is an asylum seeker, who is an internally displaced person. Very often they're not acquainted with the 1951 Refugee Act. They're not acquainted with international law and standards. So journalists need to be better informed if they're going to cover this story effectively.
Annette, your program, the 51%, you recently had an episode that specialized in the migration story. Can you tell us a little bit about your first-hand experiences as a journalist covering this story and where you felt your ethical lines were?
Certainly. I mean, the week before last, we dedicated a whole program to women refugees. It's very interesting because at the moment we have a policy in the newsroom not to use the word refugees, and I actually had to go and seek permission from the senior management because they prefer to use the term migrants, not refugees. That I said everyone that we're interviewing in our 2 packages, along with the fact that I had a spokeswoman from the UNHCR as a guest, we're talking about refugees. So we had to, just as an aside, get permission to use just the term refugees because we were specifically addressing refugees within that context. I think what I wanted to do was very much tell the story from a personal angle, and we got that. We have a crew on the ground who's on that migrant or refugee route through the Balkans and is filing reports from various destinations, and we asked them to specifically talk to women because women are that much more vulnerable. The reality is, since June, the number of women and children trekking across the continent has jumped up remarkably to the point now they now make up a third of those who joined the exodus. And with that obviously comes a degree of vulnerability and the fact that they are vulnerable to sexual abuse or even exploitation, that they are susceptible to violence and so on. And that was something that I very much felt that we hadn't really addressed in our general news coverage. With that in mind, I asked or commissioned 2 stories, one from the team who were travelling with the Exodus, another I sent a team of reporters up to Calais to the jungle, because that is on French soil. And what we did there, I think, and I know, Stephanie, you watched the piece, was the 2 young women who reported did an excellent job because they really managed to get an insight into the day-to-day lives of these young women and just how scary it was. And is. I think the most telling scene was the opening sequence of the report, which was a young Syrian woman who's trying to get to the UK, who's travelling with her uncle, who says she can only leave her tent twice a day, and that's to go to the toilet. In other words, her life has been confined to, you know, a narrow piece of canvas, effectively, living inside this tent, and she's scared. And I think that's an angle that had not been really touched upon, as far as I had seen it, by not only ourselves but other outlets. So, you know, ethically, I think I feel that we did a good job. I think we did a solid job. I would, of course, love to have had more time. One of the interesting things that came out through the interview I did with the UNHCR is the fact that, you know, the Refugee Convention has been changed to allow people, women, more importantly, to seek asylum if indeed they can prove that they are victims of forced marriage or genital mutilation. And I said to the UNHCR person, I said, that's something that a lot of women are not aware of. And it no doubt applies to many of those women who are that refugee exodus. She agreed. She said, yes, that hasn't got out. So again, I felt we had filled an important role in trying to inform. 12 and a half minutes is not enough, yeah. But what I did do, and this is one of the things I feel very strongly about the program, is after it went to air, we get a new edition every Friday and it's replayed 10 times in the course of the week, is I went to the various news editors and to the senior newsroom management and asked them to replay the various packages, which they did do, as part of the general news coverage. Because the problem is the women's perspective is something which is not covered as much as it should be.
All right, so I guess my next question, I'm going to kind of change the topic a little bit. In recent years, online hate speech has become a much more prominent problem, and the people who bear the brunt of this are women. How can society fight against, I mean, we kind of covered this, but I guess the more specifics to, you know, women and hate speech. How can society fight against online sexism while still maintaining principles of free speech?
Can I just butt in there first before Aidan takes the stage? Because I just want to say something. I think part of the problem is that, and this is something earlier this year I was at the UN Women's Summit and I facilitated a panel discussion on women in the media and gender issues in the media. And one of the things we talked about is the fact that most newsrooms these days, and I've been in the profession for quite some time, are still managed by men. And that goes part of the way to the issue, or part of the way to the problem, and that is recognition and acknowledgement by management about the problems that women journalists face in reporting, both on the ground and also their presence online. I think the most important thing in all of this is to educate senior newsroom management about these issues and to make them gender aware. It's not easy, but I think it's absolutely vital because it's a problem that many of us, that as in women journalists, face, myself included, on a regular basis. So that's something I'd like to hear Aidan as to what he has to say, how that can be addressed.
Well, actually, this was an issue I was taking up last week at a meeting of the OSCE in Vienna, where the whole question of online abuse against women and women journalists was on the agenda. I think it's absolutely right that that whole question of the internal systems inside media need to be much more protective of women journalists and women media staff. And it's not just actually on the question of them being subject to online abuse. Very often we feel there's not adequate provision and opportunities given to women inside journalism. For all of the arguments that come from many quarters that journalism is a progressive profession, there is much evidence to show that there's a great deal of discrimination still at work inside journalism that needs to be confronted. So we need good governance inside media, and I agree absolutely with Annette about that. But actually this isn't just a media problem. Here is a really serious societal problem which is being reflected in the way that online abuse is manifested particularly in very often sexualized abuse against women who are in the media news or actually working for media. It's deeply offensive, it's threatening, and it's completely unacceptable. And we need new public policy ways of actually sort of dealing with this. And we also need the internet companies to take their responsibility much more seriously. A couple of years ago, Facebook were literally forced to change their rules regarding online abuse of women. Only as a result of 100 advocacy groups around the world campaigning against the way that Facebook were allowing online abuse to take place without attempting to take it down or to highlight it is a problem. And it was only when these advocacy groups began to get major global corporations to mention that they were thinking of withdrawing advertising from Facebook, that Facebook actually were forced to take that decision. So what we have to fight against is a deeply embedded male culture which exists absolutely not just in media but around the whole of the corporate sector. But we also have to fight against bottom line considerations, which mean that big companies actually will always try to defend their interests in terms of profits rather than giving proper priority to their concerns and their duty of care to their audience and people who are users. So there's an awful lot that needs to be done in this area, and it's one of the things that the Ethical Journalism Network, in its continuing work on hate speech, we're going to focus on in the coming period. We're going to be producing a manual on hate speech, how journalists and media can deal with hate speech. One section of that will deal with the particular problems in terms of abuse facing women journalists and women who feature in the news as a result of online abuse. So, and we're hoping that we will use that to actually encourage much more action at public policy level and with corporations and not just media corporations but actually the big internet corporations, to get them to take this issue much more seriously.
All right, well, I have one final question for you guys, which will end the session. What do you guys think that journalists can do to shape this debate for the public and, you know, kind of enforce some of the ethical values onto how the public might act?
Well, my final word on this would be straightforward, is to be ethical. All journalists know what their ethics are. They may not be able to recite precisely the codes of conduct, but they know what's praiseworthy, what's disgraceful, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. They know what's corrupt and what's not corrupt. So I would say to journalists, if you want to make a contribution to making journalism better and improving public behavior in terms of the quality of public discourse, then be ethical in your work. Don't fall into propaganda traps. Don't fall into the corruption that often comes with conflicts of interest, whether they're financial or political or even cultural. Don't allow yourself to be drawn into becoming effectively the spokeswoman or the spokesman for a sort of particular interest group at the expense of your independence as a journalist. So my advice is be ethical. And be ethical as much as you can. And if you can't be ethical, then stand up and fight with other colleagues for your rights to be ethical.
Annette, how do you think that other women can kind of help, fight against online hate speech and kind of fight the problem that so many of our colleagues face?
I think it's basically, as Aidan was saying earlier, it's about making newsrooms, media outlets, and everybody aware of the issue, and ensuring that appropriate action is taken by corporations, that it does not continue. I mean, again, we're in the middle of a gender revolution here. I mean, in fact, I think a lot of this online trolling is sort of pushback from conservative elements within our communities who don't like the issue of equal rights, who struggle with it. And you see that in many areas, not just in terms of treatment of women, but obviously when it comes to gay and lesbian rights, racism issues, and so on. I think, it's not just a women's issue, it's everybody's issue. It's, we shouldn't draw the line. This is a woman's problem, because that's often what happens. Oh, that's a problem that affects women. The reality is, as Aidan was saying earlier, I mean, the newsroom reflects very much any middle-class professional workplace across the world, by and large. And all the issues that affect law firms, insurance offices, banking firms, IT firms are also being played out in the newsroom as well. So it's for us to be aware of that, but our job obviously is to hold up that mirror and reflect what is going on in society, and to do it, as Aidan says, in an ethical and impartial fashion. I would add the word impartial. That's my personal little addition to this conversation, and hopefully fight the good fight as a result.
All right,
Amy, thanks very much indeed.
Yeah, no, thank you guys so much. This has been a really, really stimulating debate. For those who are watching, you can follow Annette on Twitter. It's AnnetteF24. And also at it's _51%. And Aidan, you can follow at AP White or at EJN Network on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we'll see you for our next chat. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.